What's going on, guys? Abrasus here. Today we'll talk about the hardest thing in the game and the most important. Many players, even the best players, struggle to deal with it, and this is planning ahead. So expecting what your units can do, but more importantly, expecting also what your opponent units can do. So I would like to divide this in two phases. First one, before the game. So there are some things that you should consider before the game. First of all, I have two questions in this section. The first one is how do you deal with threats? So if you look at your opponent list, you need to understand what is your plan of dealing with most important elements in your opponent's list. So here is an example. On the left you can see my demon list from this year's ETC. And on the right, this is one of the more standard Dread Elves lists. So first of all, one of the three main or the four main groups I want to divide my opponent list in is the first one is Altar. How do I deal with the Altar? Second, how do I deal with the Dancers of Yama? Then how do I deal with Raptor Chariots? And then how do I deal with Hydras? So basically Hydras are not that much of a problem. Since my opponent doesn't have much range threats, my Weaver is pretty free in this matchup. Hydras aren't really suitable here. Even if they fight Slaughterers, that seem to be the best option for them. Rending Banner combined with Lethal Strikes and the 5-up ward save on my unit means that Slaughterers, I'm willing to engage with the combat between Slaughterers and Hydras, since even though Hydra's main targets are infantry, Slaughterers don't really have any other role in this matchup, and if I can take out Hydras, even sacrificing more than half Slaughterers, I'm fine with that. Raptor Chariots, I think Carnal Chariot is a very good answer, as well as big missiles from Thaumaturgy. So this is the second point. And then Dancers of Yama, which is the most crucial one. So I don't want Dancers in combat at all. I have 2x Breath Weapon, and I am going to use it. I have many targets to get the Breath Weapon. So any shots I can get, any light shooting, will most likely go into Dancers of Yama, both Breath Weapons, both and missiles and horrors, since they are really problematic when they get into combat, and I have a decent amount of light shooting. Then there is Altar. Altar helps this list a bit, and getting rid of the BSB would be really helpful. So most likely my machines will shoot at it. This one has Basalt Infusion, so Blood Chariot will probably just hound the Chariots or the Hydras. More likely the Chariots, since Chariots can be more problematic. But both Bolt Throwers will definitely aim at the Altar. I think all the games I played against Dread Elves, I managed to kill the Altar before turn 3. So this is obviously the easy example of this, because the matchup is pretty good, and there are some straightforward answers. But in more general case, you should always think about what units do you want to match up against your opponent units. The second question before the game is, during the deployment, you need to think about how do you expect your units to move. So this is the deployment from my game versus Dwarves, from the list showcase of full cavalry orcs and goblins. You can pause the video here and see if you can predict where the units will move during the duration of the game. Okay, so my general plan was, starting from the left, the core unit of Feral Orcs will just move up. If the Slayers don't try to catch them, they will just ride through the machine pack. Like most likely they can kill War Machines and the 10 Warriors and the Engineer without much problems. If Slayers decide to go in this direction, then I can probably try to escape through the lake. And this is the two possibilities where I see this unit going. The Grotlings. So the right Grotlings are much more straightforward. They are very close to my opponent units. If my opponent charges them, I'm perfectly fine with that, because I have easy charges with my cavalry then. If my opponent doesn't charge them and just moves up, then I block two of my opponent units and move my cavalry up. The other Grotlings move into the direction of his 3 blocks to be able to chaff him in the following turns. The cavalry... Oh, sorry for that. The cavalry has a pretty straightforward way of going. So it will just go up and face my opponent units. If my opponent starts to back up, then I still have enough speed to chase him down. The chaff will probably, behind the hill, will probably go in the position of the chaff behind the impassable. And the orc boars on the right will most likely get through the flame cannon and then help from there. So I think this is a pretty good showcase. And if as you could have seen in the video, it pretty much went as I expected here and as I planned. It is not always going as straightforward, and you have to remember that at all times you have to adjust your plans according to your opponent moves. You need to have some initial thoughts, but all plans should be changed, and this is where the second part comes. So the questions you should ask during each turn. This is much more important, but it is also much easier, since it only it doesn't require reading through your opponent moves and reading reading as much into opponent's moves, because you need to only read one turn ahead. So this is another another picture from another game, from the video showcasing the zombie dragon list. So I moved here pretty aggressively, and as you could have seen, I allowed several things to happen. I allowed his Taurosaur to charge my court unit with skeletons, but if I didn't allow this, I would need to stand much further back, so this would be a problem. And also I prepared everything else could have just countered the Taurosaur there, so there was no problem in that. I allowed his spearbacks to chaff my White King, but I was perfectly fine with that, since I was getting spearbacks and I needed to get them at some point anyway, and if they chaff me, they cannot shoot. On the risky part, I allowed him to charge his Temple Guards into my dragon, but I was also calculating this, and besides me probably winning this fight, there is also a factor that his slan was pyromancy, so it was pretty much so he would be pretty much rendered useless, and his magic phase would be pretty much useless. So I allowed myself to do that. Also I checked several things, like if the Temple Guards wish to move in either side, they cannot escape the dragon's line of sight. Also, I have 12-inch from my mage to the 6 wraiths on the right, and in this position they are now. The Skink Hunters cannot charge past them into my Necromancer bunker, even if they wish so. The other thing, if he charges his Taurosaur into the wolf, which is obvious, he will not have any overruns, even on a roll of 12, because there was just no reason to allow him that. This all is quite obvious, but I think you have to always think of these things. And the other thing is you should always revisit, as I said, questions 1 and 2. So how do you deal with threats with the current resources you have? Because your resources will change during the game, units will die, so you need to reevaluate those things. And how do you expect your units to move? As I said, you have to have some longer plans than just what will they do in the next turn. So one more example I would like to have is about terrain. I had some requests to talk a bit about terrain in the 9th age. So in general, I think the terrain plays a bit smaller role than I would like to see it play. But I think it's not the thing about the terrain rules, although some of the terrains seem straightforward bad, like the lake and the fields especially seem to have no particular reason. But I think the bigger problem is the amount of terrain on the maps. Usually I would like to see more terrain on the maps, but it's obviously limited by the resources of the tournament organizers. So the current maps were prepared for the 2D terrains, I think, for the sets of 2D terrains, and we will see if this will expand in the future. So there is a deployment on one of the maps from the ETC. So if I was playing on this map, this was counter-thrust map as far as I remember. I would much rather play on the bottom, because first of all, the hill allows you to have a much longer threat range. If your unit charges on average X, then the hill usually makes it X+2. So it would force your opponent to move even backwards. If you want to press your opponent, you have to imagine that if you deploy if you deploy your monsters and if you are playing from the top, then you could hide behind the impassable and the building, and that would be great for turn 1. But in the turn 2 and further turns, you would be going straight in the open terrain. On the other hand, if you played from the bottom, then on the next turns you could hide behind the hill, behind the impassable and the building, just by moving by them. So, for example, if you have a monster starting here, and another one starting here, then you can easily move them up in the first turn here and here and be pretty much protected. And in future turns, you can flank your opponent or come back to the center. You have much more flexible solutions. On the other hand, if you try to do it from the top, you will be pretty much stuck behind the impassable. If you want to go out in the open, then you will have no real way of progressing further. So for the summary, there are several points I would like to make. I think what I talked about today is really important for your general skill, and many players tend to forget what you will do, especially especially about magic and shooting. So measuring things like this before your actual magic phase, and planning on what your unit will do in the rest of the game. So for example, if you have horrors unit and you deploy it far in the corner, it will most likely not fulfill its role because it will not have range for the magic. Even like maybe it will have some magic against one unit that will be straight ahead of them, but most likely it will be much less useful than if it would stay in the center. So you have to think about your general game plan, what your units want to do, where they want to move, what is their role in the current matchup. The second thing, count the outcomes of most likely fights. So if I, for example, expected that my slaughterers would fight the dancers of Yama, I would need to count if if this is a fight I want to go in. Most likely not. Always think at least a game turn ahead. I'm not talking about a player turn, so not only what you will do, but also what your opponent will do, where he can move, and what threats he can pose. Remember about broader perspective. So not only focus on what will happen the next turn. This is especially important with longer charges. So if you have a decision of whether to take an 11 or 12 in charge, you have to remember that if you fail it, it is not only that you fail it for this turn, but your opponent will have much more flexibility in his movement to allow you to allow himself to get out of your threat range for several next turns. So, and last thing, measure all the necessary ranges and arcs. This point is actually a bit discussable, but I think this is a material for other video. For now, I would recommend you to measure everything. This is not as bad as it sounds, I think, especially arcs. Like arcs are much more important. If you allow your opponent to get out of your line of sight especially with his cowboys and flying models and single models, like this is terrible. You have to always think where he wants to move and whether you can allow him to do that. If not, then just tilt your unit a bit and block his movement there. Okay, so that's the video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. See you in the next one. Cheers.